Hi, everyone. We'll get started. It's so nice to see you. It's our penultimate meeting. In 2 weeks, we'll have our final meeting. Palomi Saha will be presenting on Hortense Spillers, and that will be fantastic. So please make sure to come back. And we were just chatting before you all joined about how moved we are by the sticking around for what has been a really, Wendy put it this way, the seminar has been with us for many seasons at this point, and it's been an incredible experience to get to know all of you in this format and others. I'm going to very briefly just give some foundation updates and then introduce Alex Colston. So we have a few events upcoming that it would be great if they are your cup of tea to see you at. The first is a week from yesterday, so on November 12th. We're going to be hosting an event on the clinic, one of our keyword talks, and that's going to be fantastic. It's Dr. Francisco Gonzalez, Camille Robsi, the historian, and Anki Mukherjee, the literary theorist and critic, facilitated by our own Noor Asif. We have a book event on December 4th for Feminine Singularities also, which will be great and has an all-star cast. I'll just drop the link in the chat here. And please come to that as well. We're really excited to celebrate Dr. Chatterjee's book. And then the other little bit of news is that maybe you're already aware, but Parapraxis launched last week. And so the website is live. It will be being replenished weekly with both web-only pieces and leaks from issue 1 on the family problem, which is something we haven't thought about at all together. That was a joke. We've been thinking about it for many seasons. And the issue is deeply indebted to everyone in this room and to all of the facilitators, to all of the participants, to all of the speakers. You'll be able to see that on every single page and is written by some participants. So we're really excited to share that with all of you. The only other fun thing is that we'll be having parties, launches in December and January for the magazine as well. Dates and times forthcoming. But you'll be invited to all of those. And for those who live locally to those places or locally enough, we'd love to see you there. Okay, so now it is my honor to briefly but joyously introduce Alex Colston. Alex is known to, I think, many of you from having been in the seminar as well, but Alex is the co-director of the Psychosocial Foundation and the deputy editor of Parapraxis magazine. Alex is also, oh no, Alex, I've lost somehow. No, okay, I have it.
Good enough.
Sorry. No, those are two things Alex has done, but Alex has been, crucial to sort of conceiving both those projects from the very beginning. But Alex does other things besides work via these two mechanisms. So Alex's brilliant essays, which I'll drop in the chat in a second, have appeared or are forthcoming from the History of the Present, the Sidecar, which is the blog of the New Left Review, Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies, The Point, and elsewhere. Alex earned an MA in psychoanalytic studies from Birkbeck, and is a first year at Duquesne, earning a PhD in clinical psychology. And also Alex most recently won the Dina Holtzman Interdisciplinary Applied Psychoanalytic Essay Prize from the Michigan Psychoanalytic Institute for an essay called Try on Psychoanalysis and the High Court. Alex today is going to be talking about two really recent articles that try and situate the family romance variously. The first is Jacqueline Rose's Mothers, we read an excerpt from, which came out from FSG just a few years ago. And then also a clinical essay by Ken Corbett, who's a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City, trying to think through quote unquote non-normative, or like not the prototypical heterosexual primal scene and thereafter. Okay, so without further ado, Alex.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Michelle, for facilitating this seminar. I mean, it's been a lot of work, and I also want to acknowledge too that the people are in this room who have stuck it out for months now. Thank you. When we do this again in the spring. I think we're gonna do a lot. I mean, we're gonna do a shorter amount of time because it's just such a commitment for everyone. But this session on these texts are gonna bring us back to the beginning of the seminar, which which was on the family romances, and on the primal family and the primal scene, and all of these sort of like key foundational notions in psychoanalysis. And I think too, we're going to look more closely at clinical material, and especially in the Corbett, than we have on the family, and thinking about the family psychoanalytically, and thinking about not just the normative family, but non-normative, non-traditional family reveries, as Ken Corbett puts it, which I really love. It's dream work makes the team work, also makes families work. And in this case, we're going to talk about the ways that happens in families where there are lesbian couples as the parents, or gay couples as the parents, or gender non-conforming parents and children. And so toward that end, I think we can read the Jacqueline Rose text as a kind of entree or entry into the Ken Corbett text, when speaking and thinking about mothers, both psychoanalytically and socially. Toward that end, I'm just going to break up my presentation a little bit, or just preview for you a little bit, which is I'm going to open with something that I wrote actually for the first issue about family romances. I'm just going to read a part of it to get us back into thinking about the family romances as Freud conceived them. And then I'm going to give like a kind of like boilerplate biography of Jacqueline Rose, why she's significant, who she is. She's amazing. If you've not read her before, and this is the first time, like I completely recommend like reading everything she's written. It's all very good. And then we'll break after I go through parts of the text on mothers. And we can come back and talk about, we're not going to do breakout groups this time. We're just going to come back and talk about the Ken Corbett and the Rose together after we take a break. So yeah, first I'm just going to read this little bit from my piece in the issue, just to give us a sense or a taste of or a reminder of what Freud is on about when he speaks about the family romances. All righty. In Freud's early classical account of the parent-child relation, the parent's gender, division of labor, and heterosexuality seem to be foregone conclusions, so that the description now reads like a historical vestige, an old law to forget. Yet something possibly ineradicable survives in Freud's account. The nuclear complex of the family form is organized by two dynamic poles. On the one hand, there is impossible intimacy, the drives and their satisfying crises, the infantile matrix of the confusion and separation between me and not me, the forbidden pleasure of total fusion, and the ambiguous pain of defensive rejection. In a word, we can call this incest. Then, on the other hand, there is the stranger who constitutes what is outside, what is foreign, what is mediated, an interloper who bears society itself with its prohibitions and permissions, and who evinces a way out of the suffocation of the all too familiar. In a word, we can call this law. This is the complex dynamic of incest and its taboo. This is the reconstitution of nature by socialization, to which familial roles or family roles badly, inadequately, and insufferably conform. There is no necessity whereby the mother and father are imprinted permanently onto either side of this two-faced coin of incest and taboo. Both mothers and fathers can say no to the right things and yes to the wrong things. Both can be the subject with whom the child identifies or the object of the child's desires. Both parents and child are subject to the whims and wishes of destroying or preserving something of themselves in, through, and against the other person or parent or sibling. Thus, if we start from Freud's schema, it's clear that not only whom we call mothers and fathers, but the very axes of gender, sex, and sexuality are mutable symptoms of this core dynamic. We derive our reflexive sense of divisions of labor, the partition of private and public, and stylistic neuroses, predilections, and disinclinations from this dynamic and its conflicts. The development of psychoanalysis after Freud, moreover, followed this exact dialectical bifurcation, with the mother-child and the father-child relations marking distinct poles, yet overlapping fields of inquiry into what makes and remakes the psyche. The family is simply one site where the psyche is first torn between nature and culture, incest and taboo, and then riveted to the traumas and identities of what does or does not translate between incest and taboo, nature and culture. Freud, who initially saw the analyst as an extension of the father's social authority, willed to his followers the problem of motherhood, an oceanic realm of psychical life he admitted he did not understand, or at least did not experience himself. Starting in the 1920s and through World War II, Melanie Klein was there to inherit this task by elaborating earlier methods of child analysis and infant observation, and Freud's own daughter, Anna, soon followed on her heels to vie for the role of true heir. The British Psychoanalytic Society, nevertheless, birthed the theory whose primary locus was the infant-mother dyad. So you'd be forgiven for thinking the father fell out of view. This is not quite so. The UK welfare state formed the paternal backdrop of these psychoanalytic inquiries into the infant-mother relationship, especially after the introduction of the NHS in 1948. The Janus of social democracy, with its two faces of vitalist capitalist growth and natalist regulation of reproduction through social welfare, carried out the paternal function of priming family development and setting limits on the national network of kinship. Okay, I'm offering this kind of as just a context and a reminder of the psychoanalytic notion of the family. It's out of this context, especially in the UK, that Jacqueline Rose will take up her work. She will effectively inherit a more mother-oriented psychoanalysis. What is interesting about Jacqueline Rose, though, is that even if that seems to be the overriding case in the UK, it's not till recent years that she writes this book, right? She actually starts as a Lacanian, especially after the 1973 publication of Feminism and Psychoanalysis. As Rose says herself in an interview, I remember thinking, thank heavens for this book. I can be a feminist and interested in psychoanalysis. I'm thinking about Juliet Mitchell's book, Feminism and Psychoanalysis. And so between the two of them, they do some translations of Lacan's work, and they begin to kind of offer, to some extent, the British equivalent of Lacanian thinking. Again, in a context in which the mother and the infant are like the paramount dynamic that UK psychoanalysts often think about. I mean, not only, but it becomes it's a locus. It's a priority. And so yeah, so just some more things about Jacqueline Rose, just so we know. She was born in London in 1949. She and her sister, Gillian Rose, is also this who died, I think, when she was like 48, but was this amazing philosopher. They both studied at St. Hilda's College in Oxford. Jacqueline herself went to Paris to get a master's in comparative literature, to study children's literature. Her book on Peter Pan is the outcome of that. I think she studied under Frank Kermode, pretty sure, not positive. And yeah, she had written a bunch of different books: Sexuality in the Field of Vision, The Haunting of Sylvia Plath, States of Fantasy, The Question of Zion, Last Resistance, Proofs Among the Nations, Women in Dark Times, and then Mothers, an essay on love and cruelty, which is the text we read for today. On the first page of that text that we read, she writes, "Motherhood is, in Western discourse, the place in our culture where we lodge, or rather bury, the reality of our own conflicts, of what it means to be fully human. It is the ultimate scapegoat for our personal and political failings, for everything that is wrong with the world, which it becomes the task, unrealizable of course, of mothers to repair. In modern Western culture, mothers are almost invariably the object, either of too much attention or not enough." And I think we can, like, since we have this schema that I laid out at the beginning of what I've been saying, I think we can kind of see why that would be, right? There are these attachments, incestuous feelings, these difficulties, these feelings of being too close, these feelings of not being close enough, these confusions that happen in the dyad between the child and the mother, right? So there's a kind of intimate antagonism and difficulty that mothers are there to console or to contain or to hold, and never adequately enough. This is, of course, a reason to some extent why Winnicott always insists on the good enough as being a measure for what it means to parent. And then I think at the same time too, this gets sort of raised to a different level at the social and political level of discourse, which is that if we don't feel taken care of, if we don't feel secure enough, if life doesn't seem to offer us the satisfactions we need, the first scapegoat that we're not only enculturated to blame, but is just easily available to us psychically, is the mother, right? And the mother as a figure, of satisfaction, a figure of care, a figure of what can hold us throughout the duration of our difficulties. And I think what's interesting about this text is that even if that is the premise for what we might call mothering, if not motherhood, I think the kind of ingenious move that Rose makes is that she turns it inside out. She asks this question on page 17. She says, nevertheless, why are mothers not seen as having everything to contribute by dint of being mothers to our understanding and ordering of public political space? Instead, mothers are either being exhorted to return to their instincts and to stay at home, on which more later, or to make their stand in the boardroom, to lean in, to use the ghastly imperative in the title of Sheryl Sandberg's bestseller, as if being the props of neoliberalism were the most that mothers can aspire to, the highest form of social belonging and agency that they can expect. And so out of this sort of intimate sort of crucible and nexus and matrix of the things of what we know as the demands of care, and the exigencies and crises of satisfaction and identification, mothers seem to have an incredible amount of political, as it were, education about what it means to take care of people. And yet, in the kind of truncated way that mothers are treated socially and politically, they're reduced to this kind of imperative to simply be a man in public, lean in, do the work of under neoliberalism as being a boardroom participant and so on and so forth. In fact, there's a truncate, or there's a lack of listening to the sort of complexities at work in mothering that I think Jacqueline Rose wants to point us to. And indeed, if we were to listen to what mothers have to say about the crises of care and the crises of difficulties around not only gestational labor, but preserving children and societies, that we'd have more of a kind of we'd have more to work with politically. And indeed, as Rose says on page 18, mothers, we might say, are the original subversives, never, as feminism has long existed, what they seem or are meant to be. So I think, so that's just talking a little bit about mothers. I mean, of course, it's when talking about mothers, one has to also ask themselves the question, how does one become a mother? What does it mean to be a mother? How does, who counts as being a mother? Who counts as doing the mothering that is acceptable either on neoliberal terms or in more radical political formations? And toward this end, I think even in this text, you can kind of see, I don't know, like an implicit kind of Lacanian orientation in Jacqueline's work. I'm going to quote Lacan here a little bit, because I want to try to answer this question about how is it that not only are mothers the original subversives, but they also are not what they seem or are meant to be. How is there a gap between what we think mothers are and what they seem to be? So from Lacan, this is from Encore, page 90, if you want to look at the book. If the libido is simply masculine, it is only from the only place where she is everything, which of course is the place from which man sees her, that the dear woman can have an unconscious. And what good does that do her? It allows her, as everyone knows, to make the speaking being, which we confine here to man, speak. In other words, I don't know if you've noted this in psychoanalytic theory, it allows her to exist only as a mother. So I think what is interesting about this quote, and I think what is also part of the kind of subversive and beguiling aspect of motherhood, is that mothers are not just mothers, they're speaking beings. They might identify as women. Mothering people might identify as men. But in the context of the Oedipal situation, especially from the perspective of psychoanalytic theory, in which the libido is presumed to be masculine, it is from the masculine perspective that tries to reproduce, right, the man's satisfaction, that the woman appears to the man as a mother and as a reproductive mother, as someone who can give the phallus, as it were, and to say the phallus in psychoanalytic theory both means, it can mean the penis, but it also means child. It can mean gifts. It can mean, and then in the Lacanian orientation, it can mean the very object of desire, which is always null. You don't know what it is. Like, it's an object without an object. There's no object. So in other words, I'm moving too quickly, but to say the idea nonetheless is that a mother gives the phallus to the husband by giving him a child. And to the extent that the masculine political order approaches any potential mother that way, they reduce womanhood to motherhood. And indeed, you can see a lot of that kind of slippery logic in gender critical feminism, in reactionary right-wing thinking, that it always equates womanhood with motherhood. And if there's any slippage there's any subversion in that, right? It's not just a subversion of that social political role. It's a subversion of the masculine libido that approaches and orients itself, right, to the woman as a mother. Okay. Now, I'm going to go back to Rose to move us ahead a little bit. In this context, and I think the context here is not only what we've been saying, but in the kind of political uses and abuses of motherhood. In this context, as in so many moments of crisis, focus on mothers is a surefire diversionary tactic, not least because it so effectively deflects what might be far more disruptive forms of social critique. Mothers always fail. It will be central to my argument that such failure should not be viewed as catastrophic, but as normal. That failure should be seen as part of the task, right? So women who fail to be mothers, not catastrophic, normal. Women who fail to be good mothers, mothers who fail to be good mothers, not catastrophic, normal. And yet the social political exigencies and urgencies of a particularly patriarchal social formation always would like to task mothers with not only failing, but then having to take responsibility for those failures. Sort of a doubly binding superegoic injunction that is itself not only cruel, but also robs the capacity for mothers to not simply be reducible to motherhood, or have women not be reducible to motherhood. Indeed, so much of the sort of social political discipline we see today, especially amid sort of, the repeal of Roe and the kind of reactionary formations in political society, are constantly insisting that mothers simply be mothers, and not only if they fail at it, it is their responsibility, and not only if they fail at it, they should be punished for it. I mean, this whole text at the beginning is from immigrant mothers to well-to-do mothers. There's all these examples that kind of stretch across these racial and class divides that sort of demonstrate this truth again and again and again. That being said, well, one might wonder, okay, and we've been talking about this a lot in the seminar so far, there seems to be the family, even if we started with that kind of abstract schema that Freud offers, it nevertheless seems that when we think about families and we think about couples, we do often think about the family model of a married heterosexual couple. And indeed, Rose sort of gestures to this. She says, the perfect family model of a married heterosexual couple against which single mothers are so harshly measured is an anomaly, a mere blip of the statistics, typically only between 1945 and 1970, right? So there is a wide variation to what we might consider it to be the family reverie, the family romance, the possibilities and permutations thereof, the possibilities and permutations of what mothers can be and who fathers can be. And yet there's this blip in the post-war settlement, especially in northern industrial democracies or post-industrial democracies, I mean, how you look at it, in which the heterosexual conjugal family seems to be the perfect expression of the ideal and the idealization of what motherhood ought to be. And in that way, I think when you see these kind of political and social dust-ups around the suffering of mothers and also around the inadequacies of mothering, they almost always seem to recall in this kind of faint way this moment of the heterosexual couple and the breadwinner family, and the breadwinner the housewife's family. I had this longer quote about the historical relativity of families, but I'm going to skip it because it might take us too far afield. I think so the text as it goes is that it starts with these kind of social political examples of Rose's thesis, but then it turns to ancient Greece, and it turns to these kind of, they're historical, but they're also kind of mythic representations of motherhood. The examples of Medea or the examples of Clytemnestra, where mothers seem to have a kind of both heroic at times, in principle at times, but then also maybe a kind of like a scary or ghastly capacity. And if you've read any of these myths, or read any of Sophocles, like that because they're tragedies, these qualities are kind of always balanced on a knife's edge, insofar as these characters are trying to work out their fates, and the chorus is there to sort of sing them along. And I just wanted to read one quote from that latter section of the text, just to kind of link it back to the present and the contemporary question of democracy and social and political concerns, which is on 44. Theseus, in this play, Theseus in history and in these plays, maybe it's worth saying, like, Theseus is like the good king. He's like, he redeems Oedipus at some point, after his tragedy. He inherits the polis in a way where he tries to be an upstanding king, and by all accounts, he is one. But even in light of that fact, Theseus in this conversation is trying to work out what, how to relate to these bereaved and disenfranchised mothers. So we can maybe presume he's trying to do so in good faith, but because that of course is his sort of the legacy of the legend. But so he says, Theseus concedes and then proceeds to a passionate defense of democracy. This city is free and ruled by no one man. The people reign in annual alterations, and they do not yield their power to the rich. The poor man has an equal share in it, as if to say, this is Rose talking now, as if to say, in relation to democracy, listening to the voice of the bereaved, disenfranchised mothers is the true litmus test of a polis. I think that is ultimately that is the thesis that cuts across not only these more ancient dramatic or dramaturgical texts, but then the more contemporary expressions that she opens the book with. And so I just wanted to kind of like stage and flesh out, the thesis and make a case for it, I think, and we can talk about it and we can see if it resonates with people, or people take exception to it, or if it doesn't sit with them. Right before I finish up this section, though, I did want to note, I want to read this one passage and talk a little bit more about Freud and kind of end on Freud, if it works that way. Rose writes, Rose is talking about war neuroses and soldiers. So she sort of interestingly and kind of beguilingly, parallels soldiers and mothers. as somehow kind of mirrors of one another. And I thought that was kind of ingenious and fascinating, but I didn't quite know what it meant. So I wanted to think about it a little bit with you all, and I wanted to sort of like suss out what it reminded me of. Rose writes, likewise, men become women as the pain of a wounded soldier is compared to labor. Quote, fortune and misfortune of the warrior to break all limits, including that of virility he ostensibly embodies, in order to suffer like a woman. In a wondrously gender-confounding moment, war blurs the distinction of the sexes in relation to the very acts, battle, childbirth, normally seen as their most representative and distinctive of roles. It reduces dying men to the state of women as the bearers of new life, while also giving only to both of them the right to be named for posterity on their tombs. Who then, soldiers or birthing mothers, are the true heroes? I think that's a really interesting passage for all kinds of reasons, not only because of the sort of gender confounding aspect of it, but because in Freud, Freud starts out with hysterical neuroses. He starts out with women who are in the kind of liminal space, the kind of confusing space between the private Victorian home and the public world, especially as mediated by the Salpêtrière and the psychiatric institutes. And they're suffering from hysterical neuroses. They're caught on the cusp between incest and taboo, privacy and publicity, right? Nature and culture. This is hysterical neurosis. It is what does or doesn't translate between nature and culture. Now that's the beginning of Freud's trajectory. Now, through the world wars, Freud encounters something, for lack of a better way of putting it, analogous, homologous to hysterical neurosis in war neuroses. He treats soldiers returned back to their homeland, to their motherland or fatherland, depending, to treat seemingly the same kinds of symptoms on some level: paralysis, neurasthenia, lethargy, these kinds of problems that seem to be coincident or resemble or seem to be manifestly something like hysterical neurosis. So hysterical neurosis and war neuroses, despite the fact, as Rose points out, those seem to be opposite kind of gendered practices, have a kind of strange symptomatic overlap. And I think it's worth dwelling on that a little bit. It's worth dwelling, I think, on some level on the fact that there seems to be a kind of this kind of, this sort of like the neurotic disability that ranges across them. And it's not just neurotic, right? It's physical trauma too. Seems to unite on some level these kind of heroes and heroines, right? It's out of a woundedness, it's out of this kind of bodily woundedness that there seems to be a kind of resemblance to the kind of the types. Now, we're saying too that for Freud, hysterical neurosis and war neurosis, were not completely coincident. They were different. They had different kinds of treatment. Indeed, for war neurosis, the capacity to cathect to erotic associations and new bindings and new associations seemed to have been robbed of soldiers. And in fact, soldiers who were unable to cathect and bind new associations and make and retranscribe their memories into new erotic associations were the very seat of what Freud called the death drive. So the death drive comes out on some level out of this sort of this inconsistency, this non-coincidence between war neurosis and hysterical neurosis. Because of course, in hysterical neurosis, it's a sexual neurosis in which erotic life, though inhibited and though difficult, still offered the possibility of a kind of erotic binding or erotic working through, to which the war neuroses, according to Freud at least, they were not amenable to that. And so I think, anyways, I just want to sort of stake out this kind of long trajectory, which is that in not only in Freud's work, but I think from Freud's work to Jacqueline Rose's work, which is on mothers, which is that if we start with a schema, we hold it in mind as something to just kind of guide our thinking. in all of this. And then we think about the place of mothers as sublimated out of that kind of, vexed crucible of the all too familiar into there's kind of the social political scapegoatism that gets turned inside out for Rose into a kind of political education, political site for what we can think about in terms of how to orient ourselves to what is subversive and what is not subversive. And then simultaneously take that exact political lesson and broaden it, as Rose does, into this question of hysterical neuroses and war neuroses, right? Where there is this kind of seemingly gender confounding moment. I think we have a lot to work with in terms of how to, I don't know, reason out political psychopathology, but not only to reason out what it means to have gendered social roles that seem to array from mothers to soldiers, which again, I think as Rose rightly puts it, seem to just sort of like constitute a wide spectrum, but in fact have some weird symptomatic overlaps. So I just want to start there, and maybe that's too broad, maybe that's too much, I don't know. It's hard to say from where I'm sitting because I'm just staring at this computer. But I just want to say thank you for listening to me talk. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe we do questions and some close reading now, Hannah, or we take a break. What would you like to do?
Maybe we can take our 5-minute break, let folks gather their thoughts. Alex, that was wonderful. Thank you for that. Then we could take a 5-minute break and come back at 1:45 for 45 minutes of conversation and questions. Does that sound right?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 5 minutes. We're not going anywhere. No breakout rooms today, so you can just hang out with your cameras on or off.
Okay.
Michelle, if you want to go ahead.
I really appreciated your presentation, Alex, and situating a little bit of Rose's argument in talking about the masculine character of libido is very interesting. In reading Rose, she, made the argument along the way that mothers are sort of annulled from political participation, and you provided some sort of theoretical fleshing out of that. There are, of course, forms of political participation where mothers play a very dramatic and instrumental role. And she mentioned a couple progressive ones, and she didn't mention the more reactionary ones that are dominated by mothers. So mothers played a huge role in supporting school segregation, in opposing busing, white mothers, of course. Currently, mothers play a huge role in the TERF movement and anti-trans movement, right? Mumsnet. She, like Jacqueline Rose mentioned, the slightly more curated net mums, but it's more sort of vulgar rival. Mumsnet is like a fascist hub in the United States these days. And mothers dominated the anti-critical race theory organizing that swept the US a couple years ago and led very directly into the teachers or groomers of trans children, moral panic that's happening. And the sort of people who actually show up to terrorize drag queens tend to be male fascists. But the people who show up to take over school boards are often mothers and really politically aligned around mothers, and their identities are really consolidated as mothers in a way that isn't sort of particularly masculine. And I'm wondering sort of in Rose's argument and the kind of theoretical schema that you identified in it, how we could understand sort of mothers playing such an important role in white supremacy, homophobia, violent transphobia. I have things to say on my own about why that's the case, but I couldn't quite mesh that with Rose's argument.
Yeah, those are great points. I can't speak for Jacqueline Rose, obviously, but in terms of the limits of her book, but I think, the reason why I wanted to pause and dwell on not only the gender confounding moments, but then also the schema itself around the law and incest and the difficulties around identifying social and familial roles out of that crucible is that, of course, there are no straight lines from being a mother to having a social political role per se, even though, of course, part of the kind of gambit of Rose's book, is that you can trace some outlines of that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I would like to just open that up as a question. I mean, I don't have a lot of, I don't know how to completely translate the psychoanalytic schema into an account of all those variations, right? Of how motherhood is marshaled for any given kind of protective status or protected status. I mean, I can think on all those examples, and some of those examples that you're offering, at least, the mother, the idealization of the mother as the protector of children, or white children, or seemingly vulnerable children, that does become marshaled in this reactionary way, where mothers are touted as the first line against the degradation of society, which is just to say, against trans children, against Black children, against Black mothers, against, you see what I'm saying? So there's a way that the logic is kind of perverted and turned inside out, where the seeming care, or what we might consider a virtue, actually becomes this kind of grounds for these more reactionary political formations. So I mean, yeah, I totally think that's there. I don't think that Rose doesn't look good, at least in what we read, right? Doesn't cover all of those kinds of things. But they're really good questions about the text. Alex?
Of Michelle's point, like as I was reading about the characterization of the way that mothers are denied the ability to grieve, like the loss of their children, it kind of struck me that it's sort of the reverse. Like, in a way, mother's grief is like exalted in a way that like conceals the need for the rest of us to mourn collectively, communal loss. And kind of like when I think about big mass tragedies, like the tragedy of gun violence that just like continues daily, that it's really only like a mother's grief that makes it salient. The rest of us talking about like just the persistent fear of living in a society that violent, like it just doesn't matter. It's only like the mother's loss that really, and Emmett Till is like another example, like his mother having to grieve in public as kind of the only way to get people to care about this. And so I had a question of like, in what way is like what's being described here as a particular cruelty towards mothers, like distinct from just the way that capitalism like degrades the value of human life more generally, and also like this other question of like, I kind of see like motherhood exalted in such, it's dehumanizing as well, but like that mother's grief is exalted in a way that doesn't allow for like collective mourning of like just massive loss of life on a really routine and mundane basis.
Yeah. I mean, a part of what I hear you asking is like, in Rose's bid to kind of revalorize or at least acknowledge, right, the crucible of motherhood as being the site for how we think about the not only the dissatisfactions of life, but these places where in these ancient Greek texts, particularly, right, the casualties and difficulties of war and societal loss and all this kind of stuff. If in that revalorization, I hear two things in what you're saying, maybe, which is that are we not doubly responsibilizing mothers on the one hand to be the figure of who is supposed to be there for that problem, but then also in the same time, does the attention that Rose gives to mothers in her revalorization actually occlude what might be more collective work that isn't just limited to the kind of the imago of motherhood? So I mean, I think those are good. I mean, those are good questions. I mean, it's interesting as a book, I guess, because it's worth saying that around like 2015, 2016, when this book came out, it was like a cottage industry of books on mothers that were coming out. There was so many of them. I mean, Sheila Heti's book came out around that time, and there's a bunch of them. I can't think of all the ones, but so I mean, I think in a way there's like, it's not only a yeah, it was around exactly around the Ferrante era too. Yeah, I mean, like, it's not only just a theoretical thing that Rose is taking up kind of out of nowhere. It's a kind of, I mean, I think she's kind of playing on a publishing trope and a lot of Rachel Cusk, yeah, which is mentioned, I think, in the text as well, actually. So yeah, and that's another reason why actually both of your questions just reminded me that the reason why I really wanted to foreground the UK, United Kingdom in psychoanalysis is because it is on that island that you have a mother-oriented psychoanalysis that does tend to lend itself to exactly the things that Michelle was talking about, kind of reactionary sense of motherhood that has to be protected from deviants and interlopers and stuff like that. So I hear what you're saying, and I think, again, we're really kind of getting at the limits of this text. I'm also trying to think about it in terms of the text too, in the sense that, like, I think at the same time that it might include collective mourning, it is also in a way perversely a redoubling of mothers to take on too much responsibility for mourning what society has become. Right, that is a collective responsibility. It is not the responsibility of mothers per se. Sorry, Alex, does that answer your question at all? Does that speak to what you wanted to? Okay. I would love anyone to talk. I would love anyone besides me to talk, and to just ask questions and do whatever you'd like to do in this room.
Just like, oh, Elias has their hand raised.
Elias, yeah.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I wanted to ask one question of Alex, just a sort of clarifying question from your talk, from your presentation was super clarifying, really helpful. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about what you see the role of the NHS in the, like, constitution of, like, well, first of all, like, British psychoanalysis, because it seems really crucial, especially given, like, Beyond's and others' involvements in the Tavistock Clinic, but also the kind of point you were making, which seemed to not be about the, like, mental health element of the NHS. This kind of, yeah, NHS is the paternal role that just seemed like, I mean, it seemed like you had a lot to say about it. It was very condensed. It was really interesting. I was very curious about it. I would love to hear you kind of unpack that thought. And then I have another question about the war neurosis and hysteria thing, but maybe I can say that for later if we get to it.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to say a lot more about that, but I am not there yet. I would love to. I want to write about it more, and I want to think about it more. But it's not hard to find literature in British psychoanalysis that both mourns the loss of the NHS as it's declined over the years, but then has also simultaneously used the NHS as public kind of infrastructure, and it's conjoining with British social welfareism as a kind of like family regulation system. Who gets treatment, why, who counts as a patient. Now it's immensely more generous than the private health system that is taking over, but it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of what social democracy does, which is that it regulates natality, and it regulates who gets to count as a family. And this is, I think, part of why Rose opens with these examples of when immigrant mothers get care from the NHS, right? It becomes this kind of flashpoint of, like, political crisis, of people being like, they're not in the family, they're not in the nation, they don't count, like we don't pay for them. You see what I'm saying? So there's a way that I think that the NHS structure, as important as it is, and as much as it furnishes the possibility of psychoanalytic care, it comes at a cost, and not just a material cost, which it comes at a psychical cost, which is that it constrains our imagining, our family reverie about who counts in the national family, and then also in the clinical family.
Can I just quickly,
Please. Yeah.
is that delimitation of who counts what you were referring, or part of what you were referring to as paternal?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, right? Because I think it's paternal and it's maternal, but I think, you know, part of making boundaries out of a nation state is not only figuring the father as this sort of stranger in the kind of intimate realm, but also limiting who counts as a welcome entity. You know what I mean? I think psychically there's a resonance there around borders and around, you know, right, the extent of socialization, as it were. So yeah, I think there is a paternal aspect there, and I think at the same time there's a maternal aspect. Who gets care, you know? So yeah, I think so. Yeah. Do you want to do your second question now, or you want to do it in a second, or?
I kind of feel like I should let the moderators decide that. If there's other people with their hands raised, I can jump in later.
Why don't we come back? It's totally fine. Yeah. Okay.
Tony, and then see. Also, I know Alex wanted to jump back in, and yeah, go for it, Tony.
Thanks. That was really great, Alex. And I really love both of these texts. One of the things that came to mind in the comparison of soldiers to mothers, which I can't remember how much you talked about it in Mothers or if it's elsewhere, but Jacqueline Rose also writes a lot about the concept of honor and its usage in like regulating family, regulating gender expression, regulating violence in particular, or justifying violence that regulates all of those structures. And honor being like a thing that both mothers and soldiers are kind of tasked with defending, and also is offered as this kind of like imaginary consolation prize. That's what you're supposed to get from like dying in war, right? Or that's what you're supposed to get from like being a virtuous mother. You're like honorable and you're defending the honor of your children and the honor of society at large. So I just find that like to be a connecting, useful concept.
Yeah, I love that comment. I mean, I think it's great. I think too. I mean, I'm thinking about the kind of imperative, maybe a little bit super egoic, a little bit generous, a little bit true, of like honoring the labors of motherhood, right? I mean, you have to carry a child, like that sucks. It's hard. Like it changes your life, you know. There's a transfiguration that works in that labor. And I think considering it as a labor and considering the wages of war, right, as a labor, you get these kind of wounded attachments, I think, to those kinds of bodily work. You know, they incur loss, as any work does. It incurs entropy and physical labor and loss. But I think, you know, the fact that we valorize those makes more sense to me in the context of the bodily loss and difficulty that's involved in those labors. And for whom, I think, is the question that Rose really wants to raise. For whom do mothers labor, and for whom do soldiers lose their lives? Right, to what end? This seems to me that a part of their coincidence in a lot of ways. Heinrich?
Alex,
Okay. Okay, sorry, Heinrich, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. No, I just it brought to mind but there's no similarity between soldiers and mothers because the way people when women get together and talk about their pregnancies and labor is very reminiscent of soldiers reminiscing about them being in active duty. So you're talking about an experience which is sort of closed off to outsiders, which entails a lot of intense physical pain and a certain amount of violence done to the body, and which creates a spirit of camaraderie and shared privilege knowledge or privileged experience in those who are allowed to discuss the experience as having been there, as having experienced it firsthand. So it's a sort of closed off area of expertise or knowledge, which is only available to those who have been through it, in a sense, which sort of pushes these categories of people out into the boundaries of society, outside those sort of permissible logic of bourgeois, behavior, into a kind of uncivilized or under-civilized mode of living, which relates more closely to physical experience, which relates more closely to sort of what's considered foundational truths that underlie what we're sort of building civilization upon.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at it that way, you have sort of the two fields where people can get that experience of living life directly, and you have one pathway open to one particular category of people. So the other category has to invent their own rite of passage, or so you could almost argue that being a soldier is secondary, or a sort of it's a result of mother envy in the men, because you're envying the pain and the suffering that only the woman can experience. So you have to sort of create a situation where you can experience something similar.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in what you said, and I won't be able to address all of it, Heinrich. I'm sorry, but I mean, I just was struck by one thing you said, which was that in Ajax, right, Heracles goes nuts with kind of war mania. He has to exile himself from society, and part of what you're saying, I think, does tally with those myths, which is that the soldier becomes this ward on the one hand, so there's a kind of similarity there, and then but also kind of exile, right? I mean, commits murder. It's homicidal, right? Why does Medea strike us so much? I mean, she kills, she murders. She's it's a tough ethical injunction to be like countenance that as a form of motherhood, right? The right over life and death. I mean, I think that to me, I mean, this Sophie's not here, but I mean, a part of what Sophie Lewis writes about is that, like, yeah, if you actually were to countenance and give full breadth to what motherhood entails, which is the right over life and death, you have to countenance these kind of subterranean aspects, these hard to countenance aspects of that, that seem to push us beyond the respectability of society. Again, it's a strange paradoxical resonance, but not unlike traumatized poor soldiers. And so, yeah, I hear in what you're saying, a version of that. I can't get all of it, but Carlin, do you want to go?
Oh, but I think with Alex, we're going to circle back to Alex first, and then I can jump in.
Okay. Alex?
No, go ahead, Carlin. Yeah, thanks, but you should go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right, so this is more, it's not a full thought, but I'm trying to kind of see what I understand. So I understand how the initial valorization of mothers and soldiers kind of that comparison makes sense to me. And that seems to come with its complement of the disregard that Rose is then tracking. Like, of course, you have the valorization that makes both the political examples that Michelle was giving us on the right make sense, and political examples on the left. And then the attendant and actually we're kind of just, and actually there's just this really intense disregard that goes with that. And then I guess what I'm trying to think through is like the part that the quote you gave us, which I also had really liked from the Rose, of mothers are subversive, which seems like it holds a kind of that revalorization. But the other side, the second half of that quote seems like something else, that they can like never what they seem or mean to be, the Lacanian bit that you were kind of pulling out. And that seems to me like something, like it opens up something different, like that you're being asked to recognize them as as people, as speaking beings, as like never, like here's this role and you're kind of in it and out of it. And that, I guess I'm wondering if that's a way out of the, instead of revalorization, if it's an unidealization, and if you then can kind of land in that right to like right over life and death in a way that, just being like, that's what that is. I think about this a lot because my mother often will be like, oh, I'm doing, this is what mothers do. And her mother, I kind of warning for the roughness of this, but her mother took her own life when my mom was 13. And I'm always like, oh, but you know what mothers can do. Like mothers do all kinds of things. They can do everything. But that allowance of like, you have rights over all of that. And I wonder if that links, I was thinking out to what Alex was saying about like, how do we kind of articulate this with the collective and with all the different kinds of grief that people feel, regardless of what roles they're occupying. And it's that kind of never what they seem or mean to be that seems like for me is the access route.
Yeah. I do think Rose is talking about idealization there. I mean, a joke I always like to say is that like idealization is all fun and games until someone gets hurt. Like it's you want to idealize the things that you love, right? But then at the same time, that seems to come with its own risks. It comes with its own super egoic kind of damage, which is that if the idealization slips, right, someone's got to pay. And I think that's what she's talking about there. I mean, I think the idealization kind of cuts both ways. That in the way that Rose talks about, like you can idealize a woman who's not a mother in a way that's pretty damaging, and you can idealize a mother that's not a woman in a way that's pretty damaging. And you see what I'm saying? And so you hold those things in tension in a lot of respects. And again, just to stick with the kind of like openness. Sorry, Hannah says, yes, idealization allows for the real if it proceeds well. Yeah, if you can handle it. Yeah. You can have the real if you can keep it, right? To play on the phrase. But I think, I mean, I think that is a version of what you're saying, which is that idealization is double-edged, and it has its obscene side. It has the thing that is not salutary to the person being idealized or to the person doing the idealization. And there are vicissitudes around that with mothers particularly that seem not only difficult but bad. I mean, just to be, I guess, vulgar about it. I'm gonna scroll back up at this and these. Hannah, I'm also moderating too. I'm so sorry.
Here for me, go for it.
I just want, there's some things in the chat that I don't want to lose. Emily Brewer, you said you want to say in the chat, that's totally and utterly fine. If I have somehow made Freud seem like narrow in his thinking, I am so sorry. That is the absolute opposite of what I would like to intend. And I completely agree with you about the that he believed, especially early on, that hysteria was bisexual in the sense that both men and women experienced it. I think that's, and in fact, it scandalized a lot of people that he thought that, especially early on. Emily Carroll, if you're in here, I don't want to make you talk if you don't want to, but I would love if you would expand a little bit more on this. But I will just read it if you like.
Yeah, that's all right. I sound a little funny because I have the ever less novel coronavirus at the moment, but Yeah, no, just thinking about what you were saying about kind of the responsibility over life and death being charged to mothers, right? That they have this first duty of care, and then also this last duty of care when systems like the NHS fail or recede. But then when we don't approve of that care, like in the case of gender affirming care for trans kids, right, it's the mothers, in fact, that are going to go to jail over this. We're seeing more and more. Like, and so I'm just wondering about kind of what effort is made among like conservative or reactionary movements to reconcile these two images of the mother, to like kind of police like, oh, if you're X kind of mother, you aren't a mother at all? Or does that effort not exist, and it's just, you know, this kind of amazing denial of, you know, which mothers count and which don't?
Yeah, I think robbing the capacity of trans parents to be mothers is a part of this political calculation. I mean, in a very direct kind of through line in some of this. And yeah, I mean, the first and last responsibility for care thing is really fascinating to me, precisely because of the historical coordinates of the whole thing, because, you know, as the state and again seems to kind of abscond with its responsibility to social welfare, like it only seems to heighten the responsibilization of mothers. I mean, it only seems to make them all that more, you know, saddled with this villainization. So I mean, so I think it's politically complex, but I think part of the limiting of who counts as a mother and who counts as what's in the family is itself like it's you can be generous about it. You can say it's a defensive thing of mothers to be like, I'm just gonna take care of my own, whatever that looks like, because I have no capacity, right, to beyond my own kin to care for people. I mean, again, that's almost naive, but I think, you know, or ingenuous or something, but there's a logic, there's a defensive logic there that just seems to really work over time to justify these cruelties. So that's part of my answer to I mean, I can't speak to the whole thing, but I think that's part of the denialism for sure. So I'm gonna try to roll through these really quick. Not really quick, I'm trying to address as many people as possible.
I can say something to give you
Yeah,
a chance
please, I would love that. Thank you.
to read a little bit while I talk, maybe.
I love that.
Well, I really love the Corbett piece. I found it really touching.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of this theme of idealization in it, right? Because, you know, idealization has lots to do with disavowal, right? And one of the things I found that was so touching about the clinical work with this family was that it was about not disavowing these things that are difficult about being a non-traditional family, right? That he might really want a traditional father and that he might experience that as a loss. And so I just found that part maybe kind of obvious, but I was like moved so much reading that piece. And yeah, I wondered if other people's reactions to that piece and how it might fit into other aspects of what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love for people to talk a little bit about the Corbett too. I mean, I have my own thoughts about it, but I've been speaking so much. I mean, I also agree that it was moving, and that I was moved by it, and in the kind of flexibility in the family reverie framework that thinking about families allowed in that way. Alex?
Yeah, I also really enjoyed that piece and found it really interesting and moving. And kind of back to the theme of mourning, once like the family unit, it was like only once they were like had allowed themselves to acknowledge like everyone who was a part of this arrangement, including the person who wasn't there, there was the ability to kind of like open up this imaginative space that brought them all closer together. And like that was the like acknowledging that lack, or that this person is missing in like a bodily form, that would threaten to disintegrate everything. But it's actually like the failure to acknowledge and to make room for the feelings and the words about it, that actually was what allowed healing to happen. And I just thought it was really beautiful and kind of speaks to like what I'm speaking about like the lack of a place of communal mourning, and that it's placed so much within the private sphere, that there is not an ability to acknowledge like what's been lost more widely, and that if we were able to acknowledge that loss, like possibilities would be opened.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think of course there's so many examples of that. I mean, not just in the text we read, but in COVID and mass death situations and broader acts of collective mourning that just don't seem to ever register. I mean, it can't be said enough, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that I completely agree with you. And it's true. And I think actually what's kind of interesting, and this is kind of a stretch, I guess, but you know, in the Corbett text, there's this interesting tension, I think, where the analyst takes up a kind of paternal role, but then he doesn't know where to situate himself. He's like, am I a sperm donor or am I a father? Am I the whole object? Am I the part object? You know, does the kid feel like the kid's had a loss because he doesn't have a dad? Like, what is it? Right? There's this kind of ambiguity that clearly the analyst is trying to work through, which is like, how do I be a buddy or a father or whatever, even a playmate, right? Because there's the thing I think that you're acknowledging, which is that there's a kind of like unspoken or physical relationship that they have that's at once intimate but uncomfortable. And I think, and I wonder if that's mourning, I wonder if it's play, I wonder if it's, right, what is the process being worked out there? Like, of course, the kid recognizes that he's in a non-normative family, but then at the same time, he doesn't seem too hung up on about it. I mean, in a way, he's not able to talk about it, but he's not like grieving over it or anything. At least that's not how it appears to me in the case study. And so yeah, I'm thinking about losses. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about societal, you know, where there isn't a place for something, or something is missing, right? In this case, the seeming father figure is missing, and yet, right, the analyst kind of like is able to function anyways, which is remarkable. I mean, on its face, it would be like kind of like not, you know, if you were just strictly like Orthodox Fortean, you would say that you should be foreclosed from that possibility. If you were, you know, but it's not what happens. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, there's an identification, right? Yeah, like what you're saying, Alex, in this that has to be worked through, and that I think that does involve grief and mourning, but it's not grief and mourning over the loss of the father. It's grief of mourning over the treatment of the kid's parents. Yeah, and then I'm just gonna get, yeah, I mean, Antigone, I mean, right, I mean, I think Antigone is most certainly like a figure at play in the permutations of these fantasies and these myths. You know, I just had a class in which we were talking about Antigone, and this just occurred to me when I read this bit. Which is that, you know, I mean, Antigone also never had a dad. She had two brothers. And she exists in the kinship relation in this completely adjacent way, in which it's impossible to integrate herself into the national setting, to put it in those terms. It's impossible to integrate into the polis. All she can do is bury the past. That is her one singular goal, is to bury her brother, bury her brothers, bury the brother that Creon refused to let be buried, and bury Oedipus. One of them she succeeds, but at her own cost, and one she cannot do. They don't. Theseus does not allow her, but not by forbidding it, but by conspiring with Oedipus so that Oedipus can go outside the city and bury the curse. Right? I mean, essentially, Oedipus has to be exiled because he's such an abhorrent, cursed figure of transgression. And so it's interesting how Antigone is, of course, in a no-win situation at every turn. but at the same time, the no-win situation is itself this kind of social political dilemma that's staged in Sophocles' plays. Kelsey, I was wondering, I was wondering if you just want to speak a little bit to this comment. I think it's lovely. I was really struck by it, but I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more if it was possible.
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm in a public place because I have to wait for someone to pick them up. But I can at least say, yeah, I guess I've been thinking about, as we're talking about this conversation between soldiers and about soldiers and mothers, I was thinking about like the disappointment that like those two communities feel like maybe the like two communities that people are the most disappointed in and that are the most kind of like cast aside after like serving a certain purpose or a job or something. And like disappointment as a, you know, developmental, like it's a developmental progression. It's something that we have to kind of like learn to experience and tolerate, and that it is the flip side of idealization. I thought it was really funny what you said about like idealization is all like fun and games until etc. And I was thinking about how we, you know, we do idealize probably the most in romantic relationships, and aside from it like feeling good, I was just thinking about like it's I think it's a bit more than just like feeling good. It feels like a need. Like I think there's a need to like believe that someone is going to be able to like carry a mantle for you if you're going to like invest or spend time with or sort of like give a certain amount of responsibility to or something. And that was the part that felt like the strongest through line to me between it, like, because I was also struck at first by mothers and soldiers being in the same category. And then when I thought about it in that way, I was like, oh shit, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Sorry again that I'm literally in a public place. I hope it's not too loud here. No, I just wanted to participate at the same time.
I love that you're yelling about psychoanalysis in whatever public place you happen to be in. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I just want to add one social responsibility to that. You know, you arrayed mothers, soldiers, lovers, I mean, analysts. How you undergo idealization of your analyst.
Yes, 1000%, yes.
Yeah, you valorize them, you idealize them, you place them in a position where they can actually care for you. And a part of undergoing treatment is realizing the limits of that and being disappointed in them and saying, oh, they didn't treat me right. They didn't treat me well. And indeed, often they might actually often do that. But I think, you know, however we might adjudicate that. But I think nevertheless, traversing that limit and the disappointment is consistent across parents and teachers, politicians, analysts. That doesn't mean that's an apologia for that, but it is a dynamic. If I can navigate that very fine line. Kat?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the well, actually on the same topic about motherhood and soldiers, but also in terms of you mentioning, Alex, that you felt that the Rose is kind of an entry point into the Corbett. So I suppose at the end of this question to ask kind of if you could just say more about that being the flow of direction in why you kind of chose these two texts together. But also like just one very small point of like echo that I picked up in the Corbett text, which is, so there's a bit, so Corbett talks about, there's a moment very early on in the text where he's saying that he imagines family romance as attachment as well as separation, basically. And in this moment of talking about that, he's kind of like this very specifically, I wrote it down. Oh yeah, so he says, heroic and miraculous accounts of birth are often given a special place in family stories. I thought this is kind of a peculiar sort of parallel between the two texts. One, because obviously heroism and miracle are, you know, we're dealing with religious and mythic terms and frameworks there, but more, I guess, and it's just kind of like mentioned very briefly and then kind of, it's not really landed on in the text in any way, so it's kind of interesting, but also more specifically in relation to I guess I find Rose most compelling when she's talking about misapprehension, and as you were saying also, Colin, dealing with idealization and of frailty and of kind of messiness and vulnerability and so on. I totally also agree and think it's really interesting to think about how she's valorizing motherhood in just the same way, and whether or not she's conscious of that process at work in the text. But I was thinking about, whether or not those kind of, in relation to what you were saying earlier about this sense of like the valorization of bodily labor in that way, and whether or not there's a sense too of where it needs to be a kind of heroic and a miraculous account of birth that needs to be something that is a cherished family story in some sense, in comparison to what Rose is touching on, where she's talking about how, in her schema, obviously motherhood and mothers kind of have the capacity to provoke this like unbridled sadism, and that the reason that it does that is because of proximity to death, and that's through death in childbirth as and birth as bringing, just being in, of course linked to death by its nature, but also because it brings forth the sense and kind of horrendous awareness of the frailty of life. And I guess, I was just curious, this one moment of sort of very brief kind of parity between the two texts about heroism in birth and how kind of, I just find that quite appalling. Like just the idea that a cherished family story would be one of this heroic, and I've heard such things circulate and stuff. Of course, I think everybody has some version of that. So I just, this strange moment of parity and its connection to motherhood and soldiers too, I was curious about, but also about you mentioning Rose as an entry into Corbett. I was curious if you could say more about it.
I mean, I think this also might have to be the last question, but I wish we could go on further, but unfortunately we can't. We will have a final session, but I mean, I'm tempted to say like 17 things, and I'm going to say 2 of them. The first thing I want to say is that this isn't mentioned in the text, but it's worth looking it up, and I can't remember the name of it. But Freud noticed that children early on will develop infantile fantasies about how kids are made, and that even if he went and said to the kids, "No, it's because of penetrative sex, and he gave you the birds and the bees, and he told you what it was what," right? The kids wouldn't abandon those fantasies. They wouldn't abandon the myths of their own family. They would persist in these displaced ways. So the heroization, or maybe even the annihilatory fantasies of the family, they persist to be worked through, even if you try to shunt things into a heterosexual reproductive framework. So I think Corbett's text in talking about family reveries is to say, it allows for the tensions between sperm donor and full father and RJ to kind of exist in this kind of multiplicity of figures to kind of suss out the analyst's own relation to the child vis-a-vis the path of parental identification, ostensibly a father or a sibling. The reason why I think these texts work together is because you spend so much time thinking about mothers, and okay, now we have a situation where there are ostensibly 2 mothers, and yet there's still gender differentiation in how the parents relate to the child, and there's even gender differentiation and sibling differentiation in how the child relates to the analyst. So there's this kind of multiplicity of different, it's like an array of avenues the analysis has to kind of traverse, that doesn't quite conform to the heteronormative, but seems to be adjacent or imbricated with it in these kind of interesting ways that allows both the analyst to do the work that they have to do, and then also allows for the child to process their own place, both in their family and then in society. So I'm just saying that, I guess what I'm saying is that our fantasies, heteronormativity is itself a fantasy. Fact. The ones that are seemingly adjacent, non-normative, or supplemental are themselves fantasies. All have to be worked through in analysis. There's no way you're going to light upon a familial arrangement where you just say, aha, this is a simple adaptation will work here. They have to be analyzed and broken down and considered in their constitutive parts. Okay, and in that, I'm going to wrap it up. Okay, all right. Well, I
Thank
really
you
had a good
so
time.
much, Alex.
Thank you. No, thank you to all of you. I was really fucking nervous before I did this, and now I'm not so nervous. So I just want to say thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So just again, folks, we'll be having our final meeting 2 weeks from today, same bat time, same bat place, with Palomi Saha presenting on Hortense Spillers. And there are rumors about perhaps people who were